Welcome to the last of our series on why net zero. I'm Myles Allen, Professor of Geosystem Science at the University of Oxford and the Gresham Professor for the Environment. So those of you who've been attending all of these lectures, well done. Thank you very much. And I just start by reminding you how in the first of these Gresham lectures, I introduced you to some little lumps of coal, just to remind you, each of which represents 500 billion tons of fossil carbon, and which, if burnt and released into the atmosphere, would cause 1 degree of global warming. Together, they represent more or less the reserves of fossil fuels we've got available underground. So 1 degree, 2 degrees, 3 degrees, 4 degrees, and so on. Now, in the 6 months that I've been giving these lectures, when I gave you that back when we originally discovered the need for net zero, we'd already burnt the first 500 billion tons. We're working our way through the second one. We've got about a third of the way through already. And in the 6 months that I've been giving these lectures, we've burned about 1% of this 500 billion tons of carbon. So 20 billion tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere in 6 months, enough to cause 1/100th of a degree of global warming. Now, 1/100th of a degree doesn't sound very much, but that's in 6 months. So in 5 years, that's 1/10 of a degree. In a decade, if you add on the impact of other pollutants we're putting into the atmosphere, like methane, getting on for 1/4 of a degree. 1/4 of a degree per decade. That's how fast the world is warming at the moment, thanks largely to continued burning of fossil fuels. But the good news is, we have resolved to stop this. The world has agreed on net zero. So this lecture is about that good news, but qualified good news. Because I started with the title, How the World Agreed on Net Zero, and what I'm going to try to explain to you is the way we managed to agree on net zero was by not actually agreeing on what it meant. Before we start, I'd like to remind you where this carbon dioxide has been coming from. Look at this video of carbon dioxide emissions over the past 250 years. Early 19th century, notice one small island off the coast of northwest Europe was responsible for the vast bulk of human carbon dioxide emissions. The idea caught on, Germany caught on, it's moved on to the eastern seaboard of the US. By the end of the 19th century, it had spread out across the US and Japan was taking off. Early in the 20th century, you can actually see the impact of the world wars. India and South Africa are starting to show up. And after the Second World War, we see the explosion of emissions as China took off, Indian industry took off, and we saw the developing modern pattern of emissions emerging. But I think it's worth remembering that video because, looking around ourselves at all the extraordinary wealth of the City of London over the years, that's where it came from. Britannia ruled the skies a long time before we ruled the waves. We were the origin of this problem, which is why whenever they keep telling you how much of a climate leader the United Kingdom is, yeah, we are a climate leader, but not in the way you want to be. 2009, we just burned through the first 500 billion tons of fossil carbon, and that was the year we published all the papers in which we showed what it would take to stop global warming. Reducing emissions to net zero would be enough to stop global warming and reducing carbon dioxide emissions to net zero, and the warming we end up at is determined by the total amount of carbon dioxide we dump in the atmosphere. So the number of little lumps of coal we work through. It doesn't particularly matter how fast we dump it. What matters is the total. And this was revolutionary at the time because the goal of climate policy was very different from that. It was stabilizing concentrations in the atmosphere, and we were struggling to work out what concentration we should aim for. But this realization that it was the total amount of carbon you burned that made us realize that actually a much better thing to focus on was just limiting this overall carbon budget. So far, that was the science. Only 6 years later, we saw in the Paris Agreement the world acknowledging, first of all, the need to limit warming, in particular, to well below 2 degrees, and pursuing efforts to 1.5 degrees. And that was an extraordinary achievement for the world's governments to accept, given what they also knew what it was going to take. Because not only had it become clear how important it was to limit warming below 2 degrees, but it had also become clear how hard it was going to be. And yet they still stepped up and said, yep, we're going to go for this. So that was the extraordinary achievement of the Paris Agreement, which was well worth celebrating. And we'll come back to sort of how the Paris Agreement acknowledged this and the implications of all this as well. But just, I'd like to sort of dwell a little bit on those 6 years between those papers being published in 2009 and the Paris Agreement in 2015. We had a process in place, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which allowed the science behind those papers in 2009 to be assessed and digested by not only the scientific community, but also the world's governments, and considered, that made sure they understood it, had appreciated the consequences, so that it could be adopted so quickly by governments, so they didn't end up just bickering endlessly about the science behind this commitment and got straight on to what they were actually going to do about it. So I think for an international environmental issue, this has got to be one of the fastest adoptions of action or a plan of action to deal with the issue imaginable. And people sort of worry about how slowly we're making progress on climate change. That was a good 6 years. And it's even more striking by the fact that those 6 years, particularly the year 2009, 2010, was actually characterized, if you're a climate scientist, we can all remember back then, we were traumatized by a whole bunch of emails being leaked from UEA and lots of inquiries and it was interminable headlines about climate science being corrupt and all the rest of it. So there was a lot going on during those 6 years. There was a lot of pressure, I guess, from those who really didn't want this to happen to make sure it didn't, and it nevertheless did. So despite the noise, despite all the shouting, the world's governments knuckled down and acknowledged what needed to be done. And since then, we've had this commitment reiterated, and in particular, pursuing efforts to limit warming to 1.5 degrees has been reiterated in the Glasgow Climate Accords signed in 2021. That was in Glasgow, obviously enough, which you probably all remember because that was the big climate conference that happened in the UK just towards the end of the COVID pandemic. Of course, 1.5 degrees is particularly challenging because remember I said each of these lumps of coal takes us another degree of warming. So at the time we published the papers, we knew we just burnt the first 500 billion tons, and we figured we had another 500 billion to go before we got to 2 degrees. Well, of course, if you're aiming for 1.5 degrees, then you've only got half of that. So aiming for 1.5 degrees cuts the remaining budget that was around back then. And of course, we've also eaten into it, and still are. So we're eating into it from one side, and we've moved the goalposts forward on the other side. So there isn't very much left, which is why I reiterate again and again, whenever I get a chance, we will generate more carbon dioxide by burning fossil fuels than we can afford to dump in the atmosphere if we're going to meet the Paris Agreement goals. That's a really simple fact that I don't hear climate activists and the sort of climate Illuminati, the sort of important people who talk about climate on the radio and television a lot. Most of whom are not actually climate scientists, but they have a background as central bankers or politicians or whatever. And they don't say this. And it's really important that everybody understands it. We will generate more fossil fuel, more carbon dioxide from burning fossil fuels than we can afford to dump in the atmosphere and still meet our climate goals. And that simple fact has very profound implications. To come back to the Paris Agreement, it's not clear, essentially, the Paris Agreement committed the world, I was going to say it wasn't clear whether they everybody in the room necessarily knew that was what it meant, but I think they probably did. So committed the world to halt global warming within a generation. They didn't put it this way, and it's important not to read more into these agreements than is actually written into them. My colleagues in international law are very particular on this sort of thing. But because, of course, people tend to sort of love to spin these agreements to say, well, what the Paris Agreement means is this. And no, the Paris Agreement means what it said. But we are now at 1.25 degrees of warming. By the way, on the radio, you'll hear quite often we're now at 1.1 degrees of warming. Slightly frustratingly, this is because the most recent Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change assessment decided in its wisdom to define the current level of warming as the level of warming over the most recent decade. And if you think about it, the average temperature over the most recent decade, if you're at a time where it's warming at 1/4 degree per decade, is going to be cooler than where we are today. So the correct statement of where we're at is not 1.1 degrees, it's 1.25 degrees. And we're warming at 1/4 degree per decade. So again, you don't need a complicated climate model to know it's not going to be long before we reach 1.5 degrees at the current rate of warming, or to put it differently, we don't have long left before we have to stop the warming. If we hit the brakes now, we've got about 20 years to stop the warming if we're going to limit it to around 1.5 degrees. And we've got only about 50 years, even if we want to limit warming to less than 2 degrees. And again, in that opening lecture, I emphasized this is not a complicated scenario or modeling result, it's just simple geometry. It's what it takes to bend the curve. So that's the time, that's the speed of transition that the Paris Agreement has committed us to, which is why, as I say, I'm convinced we need to stop global warming before we stop burning this stuff. The other thing the Paris Agreement did was it asked the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, this body that had sort of successfully processed the net zero science and got it into a form that governments could digest it and accept it, to work out whether it could be done. In particular, this 1.5 degree goal, because that was new. And that came out of nowhere, completely blindsided us. We should have anticipated it because it was being talked about by a lot of developing countries in the build-up to Paris. But to be honest with you, when I saw the Paris outcome, I was completely staggered. And my initial reaction was, really? The idea that we would try and limit warming to 1.5 degrees. Up until then, all of our scenarios, the most optimistic scenarios we had available, were looking at limiting warming to below 2 degrees. So the Paris Agreement, actually, as part of the agreement, they actually agreed to invite the scientific community, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, to assess whether it was even possible. And that was actually a condition. Some countries who were sort of a bit nervous about this 1.5 degree goal made it a condition of signing on that they would, that the United Nations body, the governments, would request the scientists to do this assessment, and we did. In 2018, it was a pretty breathless process because normally Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports take 6-7 years in their preparation. This one had to be compressed into about 18 months, but they didn't give us any breaks on the review cycle and the amount of government checking and so on, so we just had to work harder. We basically came out with the conclusion of what it would take, and this is the central line and again, this is, negotiated language, so I apologize if it's not particularly, media friendly, but this is what we could get everybody in the room to agree on. Reaching and sustaining net zero global anthropogenic CO2 emissions. Well, in this lectures, you'll all understand what that means. Okay, well, that's reasonably clear. And declining net non-CO2 radiative forcing. Okay, well, if you've been attending these lectures, you'll know what that means. It's a little bit more jargony, but basically what that means is we're reducing the energy imbalance due to other stuff in the atmosphere, things like methane and aerosols and so on. Would halt anthropogenic global warming on multi-decadal timescales. And the word halt is there. Again, this was a hotly contested word. I think we started off with stop, but certain countries like small island states and so on were concerned that we didn't want to send the message that this would stop it forever, because we couldn't guarantee that. because we don't really know what would happen after many centuries of net zero greenhouse gas emissions and declining, net zero CO2 emissions and declining radiative forcing. We couldn't really predict what would happen. So we came up with the word halt, implying that it would hold temperatures stable for at least a few decades. And that was how we summarized what it would take to stop global warming. In the update from the sixth assessment report published a couple of years ago, we have what this means. So halting warming requires approximately zero global carbon dioxide emissions. There's a range of uncertainty there, but for working purposes, it's around zero. And declining methane emissions. So that's the biggest driver of this non-CO2 forcing. I've really focused on CO2 in these lectures because that's the big player in all this. Yes, methane matters, and rumor has it there's going to be a lot of talk about methane in the COP28 coming up in Dubai, partly because the oil and gas industry feels it has a positive story to tell about methane and all the success they've had in controlling their methane emissions. I think it's important for all of us to be clear, reducing methane emissions is a nice to have, but that reduction in methane emissions, even if achieved, means a couple of tenths of a degree on peak temperatures whenever they occur. If we don't get carbon dioxide emissions to net zero, there will be no peak temperature. We won't stop the warming. So methane reductions are a nice to have, and people who want to stress success love to say things like, we need to reduce methane emissions to keep 1.5 alive, and forget to mention, we need to reduce methane emissions and get carbon dioxide emissions to net zero by mid-century to keep 1.5 alive, okay? And the second half is a lot harder than the first. So don't let them Svengali you into thinking we've all done very well if we manage to reduce methane emissions, and let's not worry about CO2, we'll deal with that later. No, CO2 is the big one. If we don't get CO2 emissions to net zero, warming will continue because every lump of coal we dump into the atmosphere drives up global temperatures by another degree. Doesn't matter what we do to everything else. So, is it all sorted? Has the Paris Agreement settled the issue? The crucial article there is Article 4. So Article 2 set the temperature goal well below 2 degrees, pursuing efforts to 1.5. And Article 4, I've just highlighted the most important parts, in order to achieve the long-term temperature goal set out in Article 2, limiting warming, parties are the countries of the world, to achieve a balance between anthropogenic emissions by sources and removals by sinks of greenhouse gases in the second half of this century. Now, sounds reasonably unambiguous, but if you've been following these lectures, you'll probably immediately spot there is a crucial ambiguity in that sentence. Anthropogenic emissions by sources and removals by sinks of greenhouse gases. What exactly do we mean by removals by sinks here? Well, in the French and Spanish versions, interestingly, of the Paris Agreement, it says anthropogenic emissions by sources and anthropogenic removals by sinks. So that's a little bit more specific. But the English version was the one that was negotiated, and apparently, so I understand from my international lawyer colleagues, that's the one you kind of have to go back to for arguments over the interpretation. And actually, that doesn't really make that much difference to the issue we're coming to, which I've built up to during these lectures, as to what exactly removals by sinks means. Anyway, they did make this agreement. We got to this, and the UK, and I think we should all be quite proud of this fact, was the first country to go beyond the Paris Agreement and actually enact net zero into legislation. I think we beat the French by a couple of days. And in this letter from Theresa May, which was sort of sent around everybody sort of noting this fact and celebrating this fact, she pointed out ending our contribution to global warming by 2050 can be the defining decision of this generation in fulfilling our responsibility to the next. So certainly Theresa May felt that achieving net zero was ending our contribution to global warming. I mean, I think that's what most people think it means. So you may be disappointed to hear that the way it's actually formally defined in most accounting systems that are used by the companies and many countries around the world, even if we did it, it wouldn't stop global warming at all. And there will be great disappointment. We're doing well on paper. That's the coverage. If you go to the Net Zero Tracker website, you can see that 92% of the world economy is covered by some form of net zero commitment. 85% of the population, 88% of the emissions. They have a map which shows you which countries actually have these in law, the dark green here, or in some kind of sort of sub-legal commitment in light green, or in discussion in brown, and so on. So there's various, so the UK, for example, if you click on it, you find that we've got a detailed plan, we've got a reporting mechanism. We're being a little bit ambivalent about whether we'll use international offsets, so that gets a red, but we've covered all greenhouse gases, so lots of green lights for the UK. You'll notice there are some countries on this map which are blue. Not very many. They're all countries in the tropics with large forests. And these are countries like Gabon that have already achieved net zero. There's sort of, the net zero tracker is grumbling that they haven't got a detailed plan, but hey, they've already achieved it, so why would they need one? And it covers all greenhouse gases and so on, which is interesting because that's a scene off the coast of Gabon. But of course, that gas is for export. Gabon has a lot of rainforest, and they've actually done a pretty good job of protecting their rainforests, and they've received a lot of money from the global north to protect their rainforest, which is all a good thing, and undoubtedly, but you know, if we all defined net zero the way it's being defined by many of the world's governments, and it's not really fair to single out Gabon, it's just an interesting example because they happen to be one of the few countries that claims to have achieved net zero already, what would actually happen? So, in order to understand, let's quick recap. Remember our elaborate hydraulic climate model that we had in the last lecture? I didn't bring it back because it's such a pain in the neck. but this is just to remind you what it takes to. But I mean, you know, go back on look on the video because we worked hard on that model. If you didn't catch that lecture, and annoyingly, the technicians could have cut out the bit where I set it going and then go, oh, anyway. But they didn't, so you can see the jokes as well. If we want to stabilize atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases, okay, this is seconds in the model, but it could be years in the real planet. So atmospheric concentrations in the middle, in blue, stabilizing atmospheric concentrations allows emissions to continue for many, many, well, seconds in the model or years in reality, which is makes life easier for people, but of course doesn't actually stop global warming. Temperatures keep rising in response to stable concentrations of greenhouse gases. If we actually want to stop the warming, stabilizing temperatures, then we need declining concentrations of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which requires net zero CO2 emissions. So, again, to remind you, this is what's going on in the carbon cycle today. We're pumping CO2 into the atmosphere at 35 billion tons of carbon dioxide per year. That's sort of average over the past decade or so. Agriculture and land use change, deforestation adds another 5 to that, so 40 billion in total, hence 20 billion tons of CO2 in the course of these Gresham lectures. Meanwhile, the biosphere is taking back 11 billion tons of carbon dioxide back out of the atmosphere, and the oceans are absorbing 10. So the accumulation of anthropogenic carbon dioxide in the atmosphere adds up to about 20 billion tons per year. So 40 minus 19 or so, 19 billion tons of carbon dioxide accumulating in the atmosphere every year. And it's how we deal with these absorptions of carbon dioxide in our definition of net zero that turns out to be the giant loophole that allowed the world to agree on net zero by leaving it a little bit vague, and which may result in great disappointment if we actually achieve it and then discover it doesn't actually stop global warming. I'd just like to stress there's nothing wrong with the science. If we got to net zero emissions from emissions that are directly due to ongoing human activities, then we would stop global warming. So I'm not sort of backtracking on any of the science we did in 2009. The problem is the definition of carbon dioxide removal has been left a little bit vague. And this vagueness is propagating out through the entire economy, including companies making net zero commitments and using offsetting and so on to achieve them, in a way that means it could be built in, locked in to our decisions going forward, and making it very difficult to unpack. So I think we've got a real challenge on our hands to get people back focused on what we originally meant by net zero, because that is, as Theresa May put it, what it will take to stop global warming. This is where we are. This is just taking those the global carbon project numbers and showing you how they add up. So 35 from fossil fuels and industry, 5 from direct land use. That's driving up, and we've got this passive uptake by the biosphere, meaning that's what the biosphere does without us having to do anything to it. It just is responding to the fact that we're adding more carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. Trees are growing faster because there's more CO2 there and that sort of thing. The ocean's absorbing carbon dioxide. And now I've added an extra term here. Remember the hatching. Now, remember that in that carbon cycle model, there were 3 tubes. And as I added carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, it flowed quickly into a rapidly responding tube corresponding to the near-surface biosphere and near-surface ocean, and then trickled off slowly into the deep ocean. The trickle out of the atmosphere was going to these 2 other tubes. Some of it was going to the big fat one, some of it was going to the thin one, which was responding quite quickly. So it's really important how much is going to each. And the rate of flow into the big fat tube depends on the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Because remember, the big fat tube, it was a fat tube, so the amount of fluid in it didn't change very much in the course of our experiments. I can go back and remind you of that with this graph. Here we are. So as we're driving CO2, this black line is the amount of carbon dioxide in the deep ocean tube, and it barely budges. Okay? So there is carbon dioxide flowing into it, but it flows into it ever faster as the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere rises. The green corresponds to that middle tube, the rapidly responding one. And you'll see there, although there's a bit of a delay, it basically goes up along with the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So it sort of keeps up with the atmosphere. And so when so the atmosphere is rising like this, the second tube was rising just a little bit behind it, and the big fat tube wasn't really responding at all. So when we stop emissions, the 2 thin tubes sort of equilibrate quite quickly, and then they just slowly go down. Okay? So the important message in this is that carbon is going into, is leaving the atmosphere due to two things. One, the rate at which we're putting it in, so that's driving some carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, and the other is the total amount we've already emitted. That's what's driving it into the deep ocean. And so, in this figure, I've hatched the part of the flow into the biosphere and the oceans. I've just distributed it uniformly between the biosphere and the oceans. You can quibble about exactly how it would be distributed, but the total is correct. That's due to the accumulation of carbon dioxide or accumulation of emissions since pre-industrial times. And you'll see in a minute why it's so important to separate out that contribution. Suppose we were to decide we were going to achieve net zero tomorrow, okay, and take full advantage of the accounting systems that the United Nations Framework Convention allow. And by the way, people argue about whether this is true, so I should probably add using UNFCCC accounting rules and a good lawyer, okay? But if you have a good enough lawyer, you could probably get away with this as a definition of net zero under UNFCCC accounting rules. And look what's happened. We've reduced our fossil fuel emissions by quite a lot. We've introduced so-called nature-based solutions to balance remaining land use emissions. So we've replanting forests to compensate for any further emissions from land use. We've done this overnight, so the absorption of carbon dioxide by the oceans and the land hasn't changed. It's just continuing as it did yesterday, and these bars all balance, as I hope you can see. That the green and blue bars are the same length as the red one. So we have momentarily achieved net zero, okay? But to remind you, Article 4 of the Paris Agreement is about in order to achieve Article 2. So that's not net zero, because it wouldn't deliver Article 2. Article 2 is stopping global warming. And if you want to stop global warming, you need to sustain net zero over many decades. It's not good enough just to get there for a year. So that's really important. We need to not only reach net zero, we need to sustain net zero over many decades. And of course, as soon as we reduce the rate at which we put carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, the rate at which it is taken up by the oceans will drop, because there's two components to what's going into the oceans and the land. There's a component which is driven by the fast response to what we're pumping in all the time, and this hatched component which is driven by the accumulation of carbon dioxide in the system as a result of past emissions. By the way, you'll notice the hatched bars are a little bit bigger here than they are here. That's because I'm assuming that we don't get there for a few decades, and so there'll be more carbon dioxide in the system. So that might be the sort of 1.5 degree situation around mid-century. The more carbon dioxide we put into the system, the more we depend on the natural biosphere and oceans taking it out again to stop global warming. And we can put a number on that. You may remember I've kept on talking about 0.3% per year at various stages in these lectures. That tells us how fast we need the natural system to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere in order to hold temperatures stable as a fraction of the total amount of carbon dioxide we've put into the atmosphere. So if by the time we get to 1.5 degrees, we've released 1.5 of these lumps of coal, or doing the maths rapidly in my head, about around 3 trillion tons of CO2. Don't hold me to that. Then we would need we would need nature to be taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere at a rate of 10 billion tons per year. That's a quarter of our current emissions, just to keep temperatures stable. Now, if we leave her alone, nature will do that. If. And that's a really important point. And actually, one of the really profound things that's occurred to me in the course of preparing these lectures, and I think there's going to be a paper written about this shortly, is that the responsibility to protect those natural sinks, because we need them to keep temperatures stable, actually depends on how much carbon dioxide we've put into the atmosphere. So thinking about that movie, of all the countries in the world that have a unique responsibility to protect the natural world, to allow it to take carbon dioxide back out of the atmosphere when we've achieved net zero, is the one you live in. And interestingly, of course, the UK doesn't have much nature. We're quite small. So the amount that the UK is responsible for, because of our cumulative historical emissions, about 250 million tons of carbon dioxide per year, so not far off our current emissions of the UK, we're going to be counting on that being absorbed somewhere, and it'll be mostly absorbed somewhere else in the world. So maybe we should be thinking in our international negotiations, rather than priding ourselves on how fast we're reducing emissions, how should we be supporting countries like Gabon, who we are absolutely counting on absorbing carbon dioxide to keep temperatures stable after we've achieved net zero? That is enough to stabilize concentrations. But as we've stressed, that's not enough to stop the warming. If you actually want to stop the warming, because here you can see there's a balance between flows of carbon dioxide into and out of the atmosphere, but that just holds the atmospheric concentration stable. In order to get temperatures to stop rising, we need the atmospheric increase to go negative. We need nature and humanity between them to be taking some 10 billion tons of carbon dioxide back out of the atmosphere every year, and to keep doing that for decades. So nature will do that for us if we leave it alone and protect it and stop deforesting it and stop turning it into rangeland to grow steaks and so on. But that comes at a cost to those mostly developing tropical countries where we're counting on these forests doing this work for us. And I think this is something we should be talking about. How are we going to compensate these countries for doing this favor we need them to do to the rest of us in order to keep temperatures, in order for net zero to mean what we think it means, which is enough to stop global warming? The other new element that's shown up here is that we've balanced all our remaining fossil fuel emissions with what I'm calling engineered removals, so deliberate removal of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and disposal probably back underground, because that's the cheapest place to get rid of it. The crucial point here is that in a durable net zero regime, all of the bars that are directly affected by human activity balance. So if we're still using fossil fuels, and it's an if, I don't know if we'll still be using fossil fuels, but we probably will be, we need to get rid of all the carbon dioxide they generate permanently by sticking it back underground. That's geological net zero that I emphasized we needed in that first. That's a necessary component. Not enough for a durable net zero, but it's necessary. It's not sufficient, but it's necessary for a durable net zero that would meet the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement. As well as that, we also need to stabilize the biosphere. So we need any remaining emissions, and it's important that this brown bar probably doesn't just include any remaining emissions from food production, but also any remaining emissions from what we call Earth system feedbacks, things like forest fires and so on, which may have got worse they've already got worse, they're probably going to get worse still over the next few decades, releasing carbon from our natural world back into the atmosphere. So we need to balance the biosphere, and we need to let nature do her work and take this carbon back out of the atmosphere in order to keep temperatures stable. So that's what net zero needs to mean if it's to deliver what we think it needs to mean to stop global warming. So we're in this tricky situation that, we've all agreed what the answer is, net zero. But what was the question? And I'm reminded of that scene in The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy where these two scientists have been, doing this calculation for 10 million years or something, and then the computer spits out 42, and then the two scientists say to each other, I think we're going to get lynched. And I am worried, Is that going to be the fate of the scientists who came up with net zero when people realize that they've all achieved net zero by implementing all the complicated accounting rules that we've done, and it's not done the trick of stopping global warming? So, I can't overemphasize the fact that net zero can mean many things, but it has to include one thing. We need to stop fossil fuels from causing global warming. And this is where it gets a little bit more controversial, and where I really struggle, as I say, to get the climate establishment to say this, even though they all acknowledge it's true, before the world stops using fossil fuels. We don't have time to stop to wait until we stop burning fossil fuels entirely to stop global warming. So that simple statement, we need to stop fossil fuels from causing global warming before the world stops using fossil fuels, is a very profound and very important observation, and you won't hear any of the climate establishment saying it. And I've banged on it all. I'm not going to list names because it looked like I'm name dropping on the one hand. It's not very fair. But I banged on a lot of them to say this. And they all acknowledge it's true. And they give various excuses for not saying it. It doesn't suit our narrative. Okay? It'll make people feel... The worry people have is if you say that, it implies that we can, because if you say we have to do this, we can do this, which means we can stop fossil fuels from causing global warming, which means there is such a thing as responsible use of fossil fuels. And that really worries people. They don't want to send out the message that actually there's a way of stopping fossil fuels from causing global warming. But there is, and we have to do it. And we're not going to do it if we don't admit it and start talking about how. Because in these scenarios that meet the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement, there's two of them that are basically fossil elimination scenarios. The dark green here is fossil without capture of CO2, the dark blue is with capture of CO2, and you can see in these two scenarios, P1 and P4, we pretty much eliminate our use of fossil fuels by mid-century, okay? With or without carbon capture. P1 requires, to meet the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement, an immediate 30% reduction in primary energy demand. Not fossil fuel demand, but energy demand. That's never happened. And no government in the world has any interest in reducing primary energy demand at that sort of rate. P4 implies quite extraordinary levels of bioenergy production. We'd have to turn all of the tropics over to producing bioenergy, pretty much, by mid-century, leaving food production where? I don't know, in order to deliver energy requirements without fossil fuels. The other two scenarios, the ones which I would regard as the only ones in this collection that are remotely plausible, involve still using fossil fuels after the date of net zero. Some important people do get this. This gentleman, President Sultan Al-Jaber, Dr. Sultan Al-Jaber, is the president of COP28, happening in Dubai in November. Now, a lot of people are very sort of anxious about the fact that the next climate conference is going to be happening in Abu Dhabi, in a country whose wealth is entirely built on fossil fuels. But I'd like to see this as an opportunity. If we can get them off talking about methane, which they're so proud of, yes, we get it, you've done very well on methane, but let's talk about CO2. The presidency acknowledges we need to be laser-focused on phasing out fossil fuel emissions. Notice he's saying phasing out fossil fuel emissions. They're not going to say we need to phase out fossil fuels. Fair enough, that's what they sell, but they have acknowledged we need to phase out fossil fuel emissions. And there's only one way to do that. That's to capture all the carbon dioxide that's generated when you use fossil fuels and get rid of it permanently back underground. Well, it's not clear that they've accepted that second part, but that is what it takes. So, we need to stop fossil fuels from causing global warming before the world stops using fossil fuels. watch this space to see if I can get any of the climate establishment to say this before December. I'm not backing myself, but maybe Sultan Al-Jaber might be the first. To quote another Arab gentleman a long time ago, Sheikh Yamani, the OPEC oil minister back in the 1970s, pointed out that the Stone Age didn't end because we ran out of stones, and the oil age won't end because we run out of oil. Global warming must end before we stop using fossil fuels. And that has profound implications for everyone's position going into COP28. We have to make sure that those who produce, use, and benefit from using fossil fuels, and we will continue. The reason I put this nice picture of an aeroplane flying off into the sunset here is because I guarantee you there will be aeroplanes flying around the world in 30 years' time when we need to get to net zero if we're going to meet the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement, and they will be burning kerosene. The reason I'm sure of that is because they've already been built. So, just to sum up, how the world agreed on net zero. First of all, largely by being a little bit vague on what it actually means. And this is dangerous. People need to be clear what the implications of their commitments are. It's very dangerous to have a global commitment to something while actually allowing different countries to have different definitions of what it actually means. And if you just add it up, unfortunately, everybody tends to adopt the definition that works best for them. So cumulative historical emitters like the UK don't like to talk about the implications of our historical emissions for the need for the biosphere to clean up after us. Countries with large biosphere resources and small historical emissions like Gabon love to talk about that. So if everybody adopts the definition of net zero that works best for them, we certainly won't stop global warming, even if we all succeed in reaching net zero according to whatever definition we decide. Allowed current definitions, even if they're all implemented perfectly and nobody cheats, won't actually stop global warming. There are definitions out there that would stop global warming, but unfortunately, because of this vagueness, if everybody adopts the easiest one, and that after all is the rational thing to do, if you ask a lawyer, which definition to choose, well, they're going to choose the one that's best for the client. They're doing their job. And if everybody adopts the definition that's best for the client, we won't stop global warming. To stop global warming, to actually meet the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement, all of our definitions, our understanding of net zero has to include geological net zero. That's a balance between all carbon dioxide still generated by burning fossil fuels and carbon dioxide permanently injected back into the Earth's crust. It'll need much more than that as well, but it has to have that. And that's what I hope the conversation will focus on as we all gather in Dubai in December. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Allen. I've got a question from online, and then perhaps we can turn to the audience in just a second. So the question I've got from online is, what should we expect from the upcoming COP28?
Well, the hope is an acknowledgement of this reality. They're in if they don't acknowledge it, given this is the fossil fuel COP, let it be the COP where we work out how to stop fossil fuels from causing global warming. That would be a fantastic outcome. It could be the most important COP since Paris by a long shot. But if it's only about sort of a pledge on methane and maybe a little bit of we're going to work on our own emissions a bit, then I'm afraid it won't be. So, and right now it's sort of the jury's out. What's going to happen? But there's definitely an opportunity there. And there's definitely an enthusiasm from the presidency to make their mark. They want this to be remembered positively. So who knows? Keep hoping.
Hi, thank you very much. So I think when it comes to the kind of idea of mandatory take back, as you are advocating, the difficulty is always, I suppose, how is that implemented? And, you can either, there's a lot of scenarios of implementing that add a lot of costs to the taxpayer, but then there's also obviously all these scenarios that put the burden on fossil fuel companies to do it. But I think your characterization of Sultan's position is definitely on the more generous end of what, some people argue at the moment. So the question is, if you take Saudi Arabia as an example, is there any specter of the Saudi Arabian government forcing Saudi Aramco to price the cost of geological storage into the cost of their oil and gas products?
They have made very clear to me, I've been there, talked about it, they've made very clear to me they'll only do that if people are prepared to pay it. And I then asked them, well, would you be prepared to at least say that? So would you be prepared to tell the world that if the world was willing to pay for carbon neutral oil, if you like, oil for which you've already got rid of the CO2 before you even sell it, that they would be willing to deliver it? Because they'll say privately to me, yes, of course we can do that. It's not a problem. They've got all the resources to do it. But they grumble, nobody will pay for it. So, okay, as I say, come out in public and say that. And then it's going to be up to government of Germany and Britain and so on to say why we're not buying that kind of oil. Why are we still buying the old stuff? So I think we could make a lot of progress with just putting some simple facts out there. And, the industry, and maybe these aren't facts. Maybe this is just what they say to me to shut me up. Because, but they claim to be able to do this. So let them say so. And then it's going to be on their customers as to why we're not buying it.
This may be a naive question, but where are all these carbon sinks going to be exactly geographically in the world?
Well, crucially, it's in a nutshell, it's back where it came from. Basically, ironically, all of the countries in the world that have been blessed with fossil fuel reserves are also blessed with carbon storage reserves, because the sort of rock formations that you need to trap hydrocarbons are exactly the rock formations you need to trap carbon dioxide. So fortunately, though, it's better. The better news is that the storage resource is actually much better distributed around the world than the hydrocarbons, because to have hydrocarbons, you need the right rock formation, and you need the hydrocarbons to have formed there at some point in the past. Whereas to trap CO2, you just need the right rock formation. So there's actually plenty of places where we could put CO2, in countries which don't have hydrocarbons in the first place. So, for example, and also countries that have depleted all their hydrocarbon reserves, like the UK, if it was established that you need to get rid of CO2 as a condition of using fossil fuels, the UK would sell the North Sea a second time over, because the North Sea is a perfect place to put it. And again, I don't understand why this isn't front and central part of our government's negotiating position, because we clean up, literally.
Yeah, thank you. So when you say carbon sinks, is that an active? Is that an act that does it happen automatically, or do we have to do something? Extracting hydrocarbons has some implications to development, or so they say. But putting it back in does not seem to have any incentives that the taxpayers will be happy about.
Sure. So when the crucial thing is that carbon sinks. The crucial ambiguity in the Paris Agreement is removals by sinks is a little bit ambiguous on whether that's removals that result from an immediate action or removals that result from actions that already happened. So by raising carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere, that was an action that we've done over the past 200 years, we've made trees grow faster. So is that an anthropogenic sink? Well, it's a little bit unclear. Some of them are classified as anthropogenic sinks, and if you remember the carbon cycle lecture, I rabbited on about the distinction between managed land and unmanaged land, and it probably all got a little bit, sounded like accounting, but it's a really important issue. If we declare the whole world as managed, which is sort of the direction we're on at the moment, then people are allowed under the rules to take credit for this passive uptake of carbon that results from just trees growing faster because of our past emissions. But crucially, if we want net zero to mean what Theresa May thought it meant and stop global warming, then we need to only include in the removals side of the ledger things that result from immediate actions, things we do to grab CO2 and get rid of it, rather than just sort of allowing nature to take its course. This isn't, of course, to belittle the importance of nature taking its course, because, and that's why I was emphasizing that countries like the UK have a particular responsibility to preserve the ability of nature to absorb that CO2. But yes, those active removals of CO2 are expensive. And unless we find some very, very rich entities to pay for it, it's not going to happen. But again, as I stressed in the opening lecture, those rich entities exist. In 2022, the fossil fuel industry we paid them $13 trillion US. That's what we spent on energy, but mostly fossil energy in 2022. 3 years earlier, in 2019, before COVID, we spent about $6 trillion on energy. The cost of supplying it had certainly not gone up by $7 trillion. The cost of getting rid of all of that carbon dioxide, capturing it and sticking it back underground, would be about $6 trillion. So somebody can afford this. It's just not us. That's the point.
Thank you. I think this follows on quite nicely from what you were just saying, actually. So I do really appreciate where you're coming from with emission-free fossil fuels. Obviously, we're not going to solve this without carbon capture and storage, but how do we get them to phase down fossil fuels, phase down energy use, and tax the rich if we are just telling them to focus on carbon capture and storage? Does it not let them off the hook?
I don't think it lets them off the hook at all, because carbon capture and storage is expensive. They should be building this stuff like there's no tomorrow. They need to be spending the enormous profits they're making at the moment on building CO2 disposal capability. But instead, we're allowing them to get away with saying, oh, we're investing in renewables, so we're slightly green. So don't worry about what we're doing on fossil fuels. That's like a water company saying, well, we're investing in moorland management to reduce runoff, so don't worry about the fact that we're dumping sewage on the beaches. No, fix it. So we need to establish the principle that if they want to sell stuff that causes global warming, they've got to fix it. Take back that CO2 that their products generate and get rid of it permanently. Once we've established that principle, then, we don't need them to do that tomorrow, but we need them to be doing that by mid-century. Then the conversation can move on. I don't think that's letting them off the hook at all. In fact, if anything, I think the current situation of just sort of telling them we're going to close them down at some point in the future, that's totally letting them off the hook, because it's allowing them to sort of carry on making money willy-nilly. The classic case of letting fossil fuel interests off the hook is that Cumbrian coal mine, which is entirely consistent with the UK's net zero plans, apparently, because planning has only been approved till 2049. It's beggars belief. Okay? What should have happened is that planning should have been conditional on getting rid of the CO2. And then we'd have found out whether the company really wanted that coal.
Thank you very much. So leading on from that observation, what role, what level of dependency does the UK's net zero transition have on scalable and commercially viable carbon capture and storage?
Well, we could make a massive difference here, because we've got a responsibility to do it, we've got the resources to do it, and we've got what we claim is a supportive policy environment. So, for example, but the Net Zero Transition Authority, if only it was the Net Zero Transition, the North Sea Transition Authority, their mandate is to get as much oil and gas out of the North Sea as possible. Why? Why isn't their mandate to get as much oil and gas out of the North Sea as possible consistent with net zero? Because the UK has a net zero commitment. Why isn't net zero in their mandate? And, we've raised this with politicians. They say, oh, don't worry, net zero applies to everything, so you don't need to mention it. It's like, well, okay, if it applies to everything, let's mention it. Make it part of that. So this could be in the energy bill, which is before Parliament at the moment. It's not. Bryony Worthington put up an amendment in the Lords to sort of raise the issue. The government sort of said, don't worry about it, we've got this in hand, please withdraw your amendment, and that was the sort of convention, so she did. But, unless the heat's kept on, I'm not holding my breath. But the irony of all this is that it's such an opportunity for us. Because it would create an industry that if we committed to doing this, it'd be very hard for the rest of Europe not to do the same. And we'd be the ones they'd have to pay to get rid of their CO2.
The Climate Earth took the government to account for the sort of lack of robustness in their net zero strategy.
Well, ask your MP why geological net zero is not part of the energy bill. Why net zero is not part of the North Sea Transition Authority's mandate. Simple questions. They've got to vote on it. Let's see what happens.
Professor Allen, I'm afraid to say it is now 7 o'clock, so we ought to wrap up. But obviously, you might want to take questions from the audience in person at the end afterwards.
Very happy to.
May I just remind people that Professor Myles Allen is back next year, and so he has another series of lectures about net zero, and they are when net zero. This one this year, as you know, is why net zero. Next year is when net zero, and it's starting on the 26th of September. So we hope to see you all back here for that. It's going to be brilliant. So will you please all give a very large round of applause for Professor Myles Allen.